Tonight, you're invited to step quietly into a forgotten corner of early America, a time when the nation was young. The roads were rough, and even the idea of law was still finding its shape. This is not a story of loud battles or rushing action. It's a slow journey into the hills and valleys of the 1790s, where distant decisions met everyday lives, and where one small tax sparked a conflict most of us were never taught to remember. As you settle in, let your breathing soften. There's nowhere you need to go, and nothing you need to solve. This story is meant to move gently, like a lantern carried through the dark, steady, quiet, and unhurried. If you enjoy drifting into deep, restful sleep with calm American history, consider subscribing to this channel. New stories are added regularly, each designed to help your mind unwind and your body rest. And before you fully relax, feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from tonight, a city, a small town, or somewhere in between. It's always comforting to know how far these quiet stories travel. Now, get comfortable. Lower the volume just enough, and let the forgotten history of the Whiskey Rebellion slowly carry you toward sleep. In the long, slow unfolding of American history, there are moments that announce themselves loudly: wars with names carved into stone, dates memorized in classrooms, victories and losses repeated until they feel permanent. And then there are other moments, quieter ones, that drift gently out of view. They are not erased, exactly. They simply fade, like footsteps in fresh snow after a calm night passes. The Whiskey Rebellion belongs to this softer category of memory, an internal struggle that once shook the young nation, yet now lingers only faintly in the background of collective awareness. To understand how such a conflict could slip so quietly from memory, we must return to a time when the United States itself was still uncertain of its own shape. The revolution had ended only a few years earlier. Independence had been won, but independence, it turned out, was not the same as stability. The country was less a unified whole and more a patchwork of regions. Coastal cities looking outward to trade and diplomacy, and frontier communities looking inward, focused on survival, land, and self-reliance. In those early years, Americans were tired. Not simply tired in body, but weary in spirit. The Revolutionary War had demanded sacrifice from nearly every household. Families had lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Farms had been neglected, towns damaged, and trade disrupted. When peace finally arrived, it did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it revealed debts, financial, emotional, and political, that had been quietly accumulating beneath the surface. The new federal government, fragile and experimental, carried the heavy burden of proving it could endure. Laws had to be written, money had to be raised, authority had to exist, not just on paper, but in practice. And yet, the very idea of centralized power was unsettling to a people who had just fought a war to escape it. This tension between freedom and order hovered over the nation like a low, persistent fog. Against this backdrop, the Whiskey Rebellion emerged not as a dramatic rupture, but as a slow-burning unease. It did not begin with declarations or marching armies. It began with conversations held near hearthfires, with quiet frustrations voiced in taverns, with letters passed between neighbors who shared the same worries. For many frontier farmers, whiskey was not a luxury or indulgence. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. Grain was bulky and expensive to transport over rough roads. Turning grain into whiskey made it lighter, more valuable, and easier to trade. In some regions, it functioned almost like money itself. When a federal tax was placed on distilled spirits, it felt distant to lawmakers in eastern cities. On the frontier, it felt immediate and personal. Yet even then, resistance did not roar into existence. It murmured, people complained, but they also hesitated. The revolution was still close in memory, and no one wanted chaos again. Most Americans wanted peace, quiet, and the chance to rebuild ordinary lives. This desire for normalcy is one of the reasons the Whiskey Rebellion would later slip from popular memory. It did not fit neatly into a heroic narrative. There were no sweeping battlefield victories, no dramatic speeches preserved for posterity. Instead, there were misunderstandings, fear, and a great deal of uncertainty. Even those involved often struggled to explain exactly what they wanted, only that something felt wrong, and that the promises of independence seemed unevenly distributed. As tensions grew, the nation watched itself carefully. Newspapers reported cautiously. Politicians chose their words with restraint. There was a shared understanding, unspoken but powerful, that the country could not afford another fracture. Silence, in many ways, became a tool of survival. By not amplifying the conflict, leaders hoped to prevent it from spreading. By resolving it quickly, they hoped it would not become a defining chapter. When the rebellion finally subsided, the government made a deliberate choice to move forward rather than linger. Trials were limited. Pardons were granted. The message was firm but measured. Federal authority existed, but it would not seek vengeance. This restraint helped stabilize the nation, but it also encouraged forgetting. Without dramatic punishment or prolonged warfare, the event lacked the emotional weight that often anchors memory. Over time, other stories crowded in. The young republic expanded westward. New states joined the Union. Political parties formed, fractured, and reformed. The War of 1812 demanded attention. Later, conflicts far larger and bloodier would dominate the national consciousness. Compared to those, the Whiskey Rebellion seemed small, almost inconvenient to remember. There was also a deeper reason for the forgetting. The rebellion forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth: that disagreement and resistance did not disappear with independence. The struggle had not been simply colonists versus empire, it was also neighbors versus neighbors, citizens versus their own government. Remembering the Whiskey Rebellion meant acknowledging that unity had always been fragile, negotiated day by day rather than permanently secured, for a nation eager to believe in its own coherence. This was a difficult lesson. It was easier to tell stories of shared triumph than of internal strain. Easier to celebrate founding fathers as symbols of harmony than to dwell on moments when authority was questioned from within. And so, gradually, the Whiskey Rebellion softened into a footnote mentioned briefly, then passed over. Yet forgetting does not mean insignificance. In the quiet spaces of history, meaning often lingers. The rebellion revealed how deeply local experience shapes national loyalty. It showed that laws, however carefully written, feel different depending on where one stands. And it demonstrated that restraint, not force alone, helped hold the early republic together as years turned into decades. Silence settled over the episode, not the silence of erasure, but the silence of rest. The nation carried forward, learning slowly, imperfectly, how to balance authority and liberty. The memory of the Whiskey Rebellion slept beneath the surface, waiting for moments like this, moments when we slow down enough to listen. End as you rest now, letting the pace of the present ease its grip. This forgotten conflict invites reflection rather than judgment. It asks us to consider how nations grow, not only through bold declarations, but through quiet compromises. How survival sometimes depends on what is emphasized and what is gently allowed to fade. In that soft fading, America continued forward, still learning how to hold itself together. And in remembering, even briefly, we honor not just the struggle, but the calm that followed, the silence that made room for rest, repair, and the long, ongoing work of becoming a country. When the war finally ended and independence was secured, the United States did not awaken to celebration alone. There was relief. Certainly, a long-held breath released after years of tension and sacrifice, but beneath it lay a quieter, heavier feeling. Victory had arrived, yet it carried weight. Freedom, it turned out, was not light. It asked questions, it demanded decisions, and it placed a young nation into a future that was far from certain. In the years immediately following independence, the country existed in a fragile calm. The cannons had gone silent, but their echoes lingered in the minds of those who had lived through the fighting. Fields that once fed families had been trampled. Ports that once bustled with trade had fallen quiet. Many soldiers returned home to find their farms neglected, their savings gone, and their bodies permanently changed by the strain of war. The idea of the United States itself was still unfamiliar. It was spoken aloud, written on paper, but not yet fully felt as a lived reality. For most people, loyalty remained local to a town, a county, a region. The concept of a distant national government felt abstract, especially in places where daily survival demanded constant attention. Independence had removed an external ruler, but it had not magically created internal cohesion. Money, or the lack of it, quickly became one of the most pressing concerns. The war had been expensive beyond imagining. Supplies had been borrowed, promises made, loans taken from both citizens and foreign allies. By the time peace arrived, the nation was deeply in debt. Soldiers had been paid in certificates that were often worth far less than promised. Farmers accepted paper currency that fluctuated in value. Never quite sure what tomorrow would bring, the new government faced a difficult reality. It had won freedom, but it lacked the means to sustain it. There were roads to build, borders to protect, and obligations to honor. Without reliable revenue, the promise of independence risked becoming hollow. Yet any attempt to raise money risked reopening wounds that were barely healed. Leadership during this period required restraint as much as resolve. Figures like George Washington understood this tension deeply. Having led armies into battle, he now faced a different kind of challenge, guiding a nation through peace without letting it fracture under pressure. Authority had to be exercised carefully, lest it resembled the very power Americans had rebelled against. At the same time, thinkers and planners worked quietly to give structure to the new republic. Among them was Alexander Hamilton, whose vision for economic stability was both ambitious and controversial. He believed that national strength required national credit, and that debt, if managed wisely, could become a tool rather than a burden. To some, this sounded practical. To others, it sounded dangerously close to the systems they had just escaped. For ordinary citizens, these debates felt distant, yet their consequences were deeply personal. Farmers measured prosperity not in abstract financial theory, but in harvests, weather, and access to markets. Craftsmen worried about trade disruptions. Veterans hoped the promises made during the war would be honored. Everyone wanted stability, but few agreed on how to achieve it. There was also uncertainty about governance itself. The Articles of Confederation had proven weak, unable to enforce laws or collect funds effectively. The Constitution offered a stronger framework, but it was new and untested. Many wondered whether it would protect liberty or slowly erode it. The ink was barely dry, and trust had not yet caught up. In this atmosphere, calm often masked anxiety. Towns returned to routine, markets reopened, churches filled again. Families gathered in the evenings, but conversations frequently circled back to worries about the future. Would the government overreach? Would debts be paid? Would another war come, perhaps from abroad, perhaps from within? Freedom required choices, and choices carried consequences. The nation had to decide how much power to grant its leaders, how much sacrifice to ask of its people, and how to balance fairness with necessity. None of these decisions offered perfect answers. Each involved trade-offs that would be felt unevenly across regions and classes. For those living on the frontier, far from the political centers of the East, uncertainty felt especially sharp. Roads were poor, communication slow, and support limited. Self-reliance was not a philosophical preference. It was a practical requirement. Any policy that disrupted fragile local economies could feel like a threat, even if it was designed for national good. Yet despite all this, the Republic endured, not because every problem was solved, but because compromise, often quiet, imperfect compromise, was chosen over collapse. Leaders hesitated before acting. Citizens argued, but also adapted. The nation learned, slowly, that victory was not an ending, but a beginning. This uneasy calm shaped everything that followed. It created a political culture wary of extremes, cautious of both tyranny and disorder. It taught Americans that independence was not a fixed state, but an ongoing effort, one that required patience, negotiation, and a willingness to live with uncertainty. As night settles in and thoughts begin to drift, this period of early American history offers a gentle reminder. The country we know today was once unsure of itself, feeling its way forward, step by step. Its people were tired, hopeful, anxious, and determined all at once. Freedom had arrived, but it asked to be carried carefully, in that quiet after victory. The United States rested, gathered its strength, and prepared without fully realizing it for the challenges that still lay ahead in the early years of the American Republic. When the ink on the Constitution was still fresh and the future felt both open and uncertain, there were few figures who thought as far ahead or as boldly as Alexander Hamilton. He was a man deeply aware of how fragile the new nation truly was. Independence had been won, but survival was not guaranteed. The United States, in Hamilton's eyes, stood like a house newly built, its walls upright, its roof in place, yet its foundations still untested by time. Hamilton believed that stability, not sentiment, would determine whether the Republic endured. To him, the greatest threat was not invasion or rebellion, but financial weakness. A nation unable to pay its debts, unable to command credit, and unable to inspire confidence at home and abroad would slowly unravel. No matter how noble its ideals, the Revolutionary War had left behind a staggering burden. States had borrowed heavily. The Continental Congress had issued paper money that rapidly lost value. Soldiers had been promised compensation that often came late, or not at all. Foreign nations, particularly France, waited patiently but expectantly for repayment. These debts hung over the country like low clouds, dimming the promise of independence. Hamilton's solution was daring in both scope and implication. He proposed that the federal government assume the debts of the individual states, consolidating them into a single national obligation. In doing so, the United States would signal to the world that it honored its commitments. Credit would be restored. Investment would follow. The nation, bound together by shared responsibility, would grow stronger. On paper, the plan made sense. In practice, it stirred unease. For citizens living in coastal cities, where trade and finance were already part of daily life, Hamilton's ideas felt logical, even reassuring. Banks, bonds, and national credit were familiar concepts. These communities saw opportunity in stability. They envisioned a future where American commerce flowed confidently across oceans, backed by a government that could be trusted far from the ports and counting houses. However, the vision felt distant, almost foreign. In rural regions and on the frontier, economic life followed a different rhythm. Wealth was measured in land, livestock, and harvests. Barter was common. Cash was scarce. The idea of national debt as a tool rather than a burden did not resonate in the same way. To many farmers, especially those who had already paid off their state debts through years of hardship, Hamilton's plan felt unfair. Why should they now be taxed to cover obligations they believed were settled? Why should distant investors profit from bonds purchased cheaply, while ordinary people struggled to make ends meet? These questions did not erupt into immediate outrage. Instead, they settled quietly into the background of daily life, like a persistent unease. Resentment does not always announce itself. Often, it grows slowly, fed by small frustrations and a sense of being overlooked. Hamilton's vision extended beyond debt alone. He believed in a strong central government capable of guiding economic development. He supported a national bank to regulate currency and provide financial stability. He encouraged manufacturing, hoping to reduce dependence on foreign goods. Each of these ideas, taken individually, aimed at strengthening the Republic. Together, they marked a clear shift towards centralized authority for a people who had recently fought against distant control. This shift felt unsettling. Even those who trusted Hamilton's intentions worried about the precedent being set. Power, once gathered, had a way of growing. The balance between liberty and order, so carefully negotiated during the founding, seemed once again in question. Yet Hamilton was not blind to these concerns. He understood that his policies would be unpopular in some quarters. Still, he believed that short-term discomfort was a price worth paying for long-term survival. Without financial credibility, he argued, freedom itself would remain fragile. The tension lay not just in the policies, but in how they were experienced. In the halls of government, debates were measured, theoretical, and abstract. In distant communities, the consequences were tangible. Taxes were felt in empty purses. Regulations were felt in disrupted routines. What seemed like necessary adjustments to one group felt like impositions to another. This gap between intention and experience widened quietly. No single law caused it. No single speech inflamed it. Instead, it accumulated through everyday moments, through a farmer calculating costs, through a distiller weighing risks, through families wondering whether the new nation truly understood their lives. Hamilton's gamble depended on trust. Trust that citizens would accept temporary sacrifice for future gain, and trust that the federal government would wield its power responsibly. In places where government presence was already minimal, that trust was thin. People were more likely to trust neighbors than institutions, local customs more than distant laws. Still, the plan moved forward. Debts were assumed. Credit improved. The nation's financial standing strengthened. By many measures, Hamilton's vision succeeded. The United States gained stability and credibility at a critical moment in its development. But success came with a quiet cost. The seeds of resentment, once planted, did not disappear. They rested beneath the surface, nourished by distance geographic, cultural, and economic. Over time, these seeds would find expression, not necessarily against Hamilton himself, but against what he represented, a government growing more confident in its authority. In retrospect, it is tempting to see this tension as inevitable. A nation spanning vast distances, filled with diverse livelihoods, could not adopt a single economic vision without friction. Hamilton's plan did not create division. It revealed it. It exposed the challenge of governing a people who shared ideals but lived very different lives. As the years passed, Hamilton's name became associated with ambition, intellect, and controversy. Admired by some, distrusted by others, he remained a symbol of the Republic's willingness to take risks in pursuit of permanence. His gamble was not reckless, but it was bold, and boldness rarely leaves everyone at ease. Now, as the pace of the story slows and your thoughts begin to soften, this chapter of early American history offers a gentle truth. Nations are shaped not only by victories and ideals, but by practical decisions made under pressure. Decisions that solve one problem while quietly creating another. Hamilton's vision helped steady the young republic, giving it the financial footing it needed to endure. At the same time, it reminded Americans that progress often feels uneven, and that stability achieved in one place can feel like strain in another. In that quiet tension between promise and perception, the United States continued forward, still learning how to balance strength with understanding, and how to carry the weight of its own ambitions without losing sight of the people living far from power. And as you rest now, this story settles into calm reflection, inviting you to let the questions drift away, leaving only the steady rhythm of a nation finding its way, step by careful step. Asterisk, in the western hills of early America, where roads thinned into paths and paths dissolved into forest, life moved at a slower, heavier pace. Distance shaped everything. Towns were scattered, markets were far away, and news arrived late if it arrived at all. In this quiet landscape, far removed from the counting houses of the East, whiskey became something far greater than a drink. It became a solution, a language, a lifeline. To understand why distilled grain held such importance, it helps to picture daily life along the frontier, especially in regions like the backcountry of Appalachian Mountains. Families lived on land carved painstakingly from wilderness. Clearing fields took years. Harvests depended on weather, strength, and luck. Cash was scarce, not because people were unwilling to work, but because formal economic systems barely reached this far. Farmers grew grain, corn, rye, barley because it thrived in the soil and climate. But grain posed a problem. It was bulky and heavy. Transporting it over muddy tracks or mountain passes to distant markets could take days or weeks. Much of it would spoil before it ever reached a buyer. For families already balancing survival, this was an unacceptable loss. Distilling grain into whiskey solved several problems at once. It reduced volume, it preserved value, and it created a product that was widely desired. A barrel of whiskey could travel farther than sacks of grain and arrive intact. In a world short on coin, whiskey functioned as a practical substitute to pay workers, settle debts, and trade for supplies. But whiskey was not only economic, it was woven into the social fabric of frontier life. Long days of labor ended with shared drinks by firelight. Celebrations, barn raisings, and community gatherings often included it. In a land where isolation was common and comfort limited, whiskey offered warmth both physical and emotional. Medical knowledge on the frontier was limited, and professional doctors were rare. Whiskey was used as a remedy, a disinfectant, and a pain reliever. It appeared in household medicine chests, alongside herbs and salves. In moments of illness or injury, it provided a sense of control in situations otherwise governed by uncertainty. For many families, distilling was not an indulgence. It was a necessity. Small stills operated seasonally, transforming surplus grain into something useful. These operations were modest, often run by the same hands that tilled the fields. They were not enterprises in the modern sense, but extensions of self-reliance. This way of life existed largely beyond the attention of national leaders. In eastern cities, whiskey was consumed, taxed, and traded within established systems. On the frontier, it lived a different life, closer to the land, closer to need. The same product carried very different meanings depending on where one stood. Communication between these worlds was limited. Letters traveled slowly. Laws passed in distant capitals arrived stripped of context. When policies were crafted, they often reflected assumptions rooted in urban experience, assumptions that did not always translate well to frontier realities. Thus, when whiskey became subject to federal regulation and taxation, the impact was not felt evenly. For city dwellers, it was one item among many. For frontier farmers, it touched the center of daily survival. What appeared to be a modest excise tax on paper felt like a direct challenge to an entire way of life. This disconnect was not immediately explosive. At first, it was met with confusion and quiet frustration. How could lawmakers fail to understand the role whiskey played? How could a government born from resistance now impose measures that seemed blind to hardship? Yet the resentment that followed was not rooted in defiance alone. It was rooted in distance. Physical distance from power, cultural distance from decision-makers, economic distance from systems built around cash and credit rather than barter and trust. In frontier communities, relationships mattered more than regulations. Neighbors depended on one another. Reputation carried weight. Transactions were personal. A system that demanded standardized payment and compliance felt foreign, even threatening. Still, it is important to pause here to slow the story and let its texture settle. These farmers were not seeking disorder. They were not rejecting the idea of government itself. Many had fought for independence. They valued stability as deeply as anyone. What they feared was invisibility, the sense that their lives were being shaped by people who had never walked their roads or lifted their burdens. Whiskey, in this context, became symbolic. It stood at the intersection of labor, identity, and autonomy. To regulate it without understanding its role was to misunderstand the frontier itself. As evenings fell over the hills, distillers worked by lamplight. The rhythmic drip of the still was a familiar sound, steady, patient, unhurried. It mirrored the pace of frontier life. Nothing here moved quickly. Everything took time. This slowness bred resilience. Families learned to adapt. They reused what they had. They relied on skills passed down through generations. Whiskey was one of those skills, knowledge refined not in academies, but through repetition and necessity. When tension later arose between these communities and the federal government, it did not spring from recklessness. It grew from a quiet conviction that survival should not be penalized. That practical solutions, born of hardship, deserved understanding, not suspicion. Looking back, it becomes easier to see how misunderstanding shaped events. Policies designed for national good collided with local realities. Neither side saw the full picture. And in that gap, discomfort grew. Now, as you listen and let your thoughts drift, This chapter invites gentle reflection. It reminds us that objects carry meaning beyond their surface, that a simple drink can become a symbol of endurance, that history is shaped as much by daily routines as by grand decisions. In the Western Hills, whiskey flowed not in excess, but in purpose. It warmed hands, sealed agreements, and sustained families through long seasons. It was part of the quiet rhythm of frontier life, steady, practical, and deeply human. And as night settles in, this story softens, leaving behind the image of a lantern-lit cabin, a still quietly at work, and a people doing their best to endure in a land that asked much of them. In the abstract language of government, a tax can sound small. It appears as a line in a ledger, a percentage calculated on paper, a tool designed to balance accounts and secure stability. From a distance, it feels orderly, almost impersonal. But on the American frontier of the 1790s, distance was exactly the problem. What felt distant in theory arrived close, unmistakably close, in the daily rhythms of family life. For lawmakers in eastern cities, the federal excise tax on distilled spirits was a practical measure. The nation carried heavy debt, and revenue had to come from somewhere. Whiskey, widely consumed and already associated with trade, seemed a reasonable choice. The tax was structured, debated, and passed with the calm assurance of necessity. On paper, it looked manageable. On the frontier, paper did not tell the whole story. Frontier families lived by patterns shaped by daylight, seasons, and survival. Mornings began early. Fields needed tending, animals feeding, tools repairing. Evenings brought brief rest, often spent preparing for the next day. There was little margin for error. A poor harvest, an illness, or a broken wagon could ripple through an entire household. In this setting, whiskey was not an afterthought. It was woven into routine. Grain became whiskey because it had tubi, because it traveled better, traded easier, and lasted longer. A tax on whiskey was not a tax on excess. It was a tax on efficiency, on adaptation, on the small adjustments that made frontier life possible. The structure of the tax itself added to the strain. It required registration of stills, record keeping, and payment in cash. These requirements assumed access to officials, to currency, to transportation that many frontier families simply did not have. Compliance was not merely inconvenient, it was disruptive. Cash was rare. Transactions often relied on barter or credit extended between neighbors. Paying a tax in money meant finding money first, selling goods at unfavorable prices, or traveling long distances to reach a market. What looked like a modest fee, in theory, became a significant burden in practice. Beyond the financial strain, there was the feeling of being watched. Federal agents, tasked with enforcing the tax, represented a presence unfamiliar to many frontier communities. Their arrival was not always hostile, but it was unsettling. These were strangers carrying authority from a distant government, asking questions, taking notes, and expecting compliance. For families who prized independence and local trust, this intrusion felt personal. It was not simply about money. It was about autonomy, about who had the right to shape daily life. The tax reached into kitchens, barns, and still houses. It touched routines passed down through generations. Even those inclined to obey the law felt conflicted. They did not see themselves as lawbreakers or rebels. Many had supported independence precisely because they believed in lawful self-governance. Yet now, law felt less like protection and more like pressure. This emotional tension is easy to overlook in hindsight. From a distance of centuries, the tax can appear as a reasonable policy met with unreasonable resistance. But lived experience tells a quieter story, one of households calculating costs by candlelight, of parents weighing obligations against necessities. The tax also highlighted differences within communities. Larger distillers, often closer to markets and cash, could absorb the cost more easily. Small-scale producers, distilling only surplus grain, felt the weight most sharply. What had once been an equalizing practice now seemed to favor those with greater resources. Resentment did not arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, like water rising behind a dam. Conversations turned more serious. Questions repeated themselves. Why was this tax necessary? Why did it fall here, on people already stretched thin? Why did understanding seem so far away? The distance between policymakers and frontier families was not merely geographic, it was experiential. Those drafting the law lived in a world of ledgers and contracts. Those living under it navigated mud, weather, and uncertainty. Each side believed it was acting reasonably. Each side struggled to see the other clearly. Behind the scenes, figures like Alexander Hamilton believed deeply in the necessity of such measures. He saw revenue as the backbone of national survival. Without it, promises would fail, credit would collapse, and the republic itself could weaken. From his vantage point, the tax was not personal, it was essential. Yet policies, once enacted, do not remain abstract. They enter lives. They change patterns. They ask for adjustments that may feel small to some and overwhelming to others. On the frontier, the whiskey tax touched everyday life with surprising force. Families adapted where they could. Some reduced distillation, others sought ways around the system. Many simply worried about fines, about visits from officials, about the future. Anxiety became another quiet companion, joining the long list of frontier hardships. What is striking, looking back, is how ordinary these reactions were. They were not driven by ideology alone, but by practical concern. People asked not for exemption, but for understanding. They wanted laws that reflected lived reality, not distant assumption. As night settles in and this story slows, it invites a gentle shift in perspective. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by grand debates and national goals, but by how those decisions feel at the level of the household, by how they alter routines, expectations, and the sense of control people hold over their own days. The whiskey tax was distant in theory, numbers discussed in quiet rooms far away, but in the daily rhythms of frontier families, it was close, immediate, and deeply felt. It reached into the simplest acts of survival and asked more of people who already gave much. And in that quiet strain, the story of the Whiskey Rebellion moved one step closer, not through loud defiance, but through the accumulation of everyday pressure. A reminder that even well-intentioned laws carry weight, and that understanding often begins not with authority, but with listening. As you rest now, let this chapter soften into stillness, leaving behind the image of a family at the end of a long day counting, considering, and hoping that tomorrow will ask just a little less. Resistance does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins as a murmur soft enough to be mistaken for the wind moving through trees, gentle enough to pass unnoticed by those far away. In the isolated valleys of the American frontier, this is how frustration first took shape, not in shouts or marches, but in quiet conversations held low, where voices blended with the sounds of evening. Life in these valleys encouraged discretion. Homes were spaced far apart. Travel took time. News moved slowly, carried by word of mouth rather than print. People learned to rely on one another, and trust was built carefully, over years of shared labor and hardship. In such places, open confrontation felt risky. Survival depended on caution. When dissatisfaction with the whiskey tax began to surface, it did so gently. A comment made while repairing a fence, a question raised at the end of a long day's work, a pause in conversation, followed by a look that said more than words. These were not calls to action, but acknowledgments of shared unease. At first, many assumed the issue would resolve itself. Laws passed in distant capitals had a way of softening as they traveled west. Enforcement was uneven. Time often dulled the sharpest edges of policy. People waited, hoping for adjustment or exemption, or simply for attention. But as months passed, and visits from officials became more frequent, patience thinned. The presence of tax collectors, even when polite, served as a reminder that the law was real, and that it would not simply fade away. Each visit stirred conversation afterward. Each question asked was repeated, reconsidered, and quietly debated. Meetings began to form, though they were rarely announced as such. A gathering at a neighbor's barn might include more discussion than planned. A church meeting might linger longer than usual. People stayed behind after others left, lowering their voices, testing the boundaries of agreement. These gatherings were careful. No one wanted to be the first to speak too boldly. Words were chosen with precision. Concerns were framed as questions, not accusations. There was an unspoken understanding that caution was not weakness, but wisdom. Handwritten notes began to circulate, short, thoughtful messages passed from one trusted hand to another. They warned of upcoming visits, shared interpretations of the law, or simply expressed solidarity. In a world without instant communication, such notes carried weight. They were tangible proof that others felt the same strain. What is striking about this period is how restrained it was. Despite growing frustration, there was little appetite for chaos. People did not want conflict for its own sake. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted flexibility. Above all, they wanted to be seen. The valleys themselves shaped this restraint. Surrounded by hills and forests, communities felt both protected and confined. News from the outside world arrived filtered through distance. Decisions made elsewhere felt abstract, but their consequences were immediate. This contrast sharpened awareness without fueling recklessness. As whispers spread, they carried stories of fines imposed, of stills registered under protest, of families forced to choose between compliance and hardship. Each story added texture to the shared understanding. Individually, they might have seemed manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Still, resistance remained largely internal. People debated among themselves. Some urged patience, believing compromise was possible. Others argued that silence was being mistaken for acceptance. These discussions unfolded slowly, shaped by respect for neighbors and fear of unintended consequences. The absence of loud opposition was in part a reflection of recent memory. The Revolutionary War was still close enough to feel. Many had lived through its uncertainty. They knew how quickly ideals could give way to suffering. No one wanted to relive that experience lightly. Yet memory can cut both ways. The same war that taught caution also taught that voices matter, that collective concern, once expressed, could bring change. The challenge lay in finding a way to speak without shattering the fragile peace. As frustration spread, it did so unevenly. Some valleys felt it more keenly than others. Geography, access to markets, and local leadership all played roles. This unevenness added complexity. There was no single voice, no unified message, only a growing awareness that something was misaligned. What connected these scattered communities was not anger, but recognition, a shared sense that daily life was being shaped by forces that felt distant and unresponsive. That recognition did not demand immediate action, but it refused to be ignored. In the evenings, as lamps were lit and families gathered indoors, conversations returned to the same themes. How much longer could this continue? What would happen if nothing changed? What risks were worth taking, and which were not? These questions lingered in the air, unanswered. They did not disrupt sleep so much as settle into it, shaping dreams and worries alike. Resistance, at this stage, was less a movement than a mood, quiet shift in how people understood their place within the new nation. Looking back, it is easy to overlook these murmurs, to focus instead on the moments when tension became visible. But history is often decided long before it announces itself. It is shaped in kitchens and fields, in whispered exchanges and cautious notes. As you listen now, and the story slows into calm reflection, imagine those valleys at dusk. Smoke rising gently from chimneys, paths growing quiet. Inside, people speaking softly, weighing words as carefully as grain, uncertain of what tomorrow will bring. In those murmurs, the Whiskey Rebellion took its earliest breath not as a shout, but as a shared understanding spreading slowly across the countryside. For a long time, resistance on the frontier had remained abstract. It lived in conversations, in glances exchanged across tables, in the shared understanding that something was wrong. Anger existed, but it had no clear direction. It was aimed at ideas, at policies, at a distant government that felt more like a concept than a presence. And then, slowly, and almost inevitably, that changed. The moment protest turned personal was not marked by a single decision or a sudden shift in character. It unfolded gradually, shaped by proximity. Laws, after all, do not enforce themselves. They arrive, carried by people, by men with names, faces, and roots that lead directly to someone's doorstep. When federal tax collectors began traveling deeper into frontier regions, the abstract became concrete. These officials were often neighbors by geography, if not by loyalty. They stayed in local homes, spoke with familiar accents, and walked the same muddy paths as everyone else. Yet they carried authority from far away, and that authority followed them wherever they went. At first, encounters were restrained, conversations were formal, even polite. Papers were presented. Questions were asked. Some complied reluctantly. Others delayed, hoping for clarification or change. Each visit, however, calm, left a trace behind. People remembered the knock on the door. They remembered the tone of voice. They remembered the feeling of being assessed. As enforcement continued, patience wore thin. The tax was no longer a rumor or a possibility, it was an intrusion. It entered barns and still houses. It required declarations, measurements, and records. It demanded time and money from people who felt they had little of either to spare. Anger, once shared quietly, began to search for an outlet. It is a human tendency to personalize pressure, to attach feelings to the nearest representative of a larger force. In this case, resentment focused not on distant lawmakers, but on the officials who appeared in person. This shift changed everything. Names were spoken more often. Routes were tracked. Schedules were discussed, not with violence in mind at first, but with frustration. People wanted to know who was coming and when. They wanted to prepare not just practically, but emotionally. Warnings began to circulate, sometimes delivered anonymously. Notes left on doors, messages passed through trusted intermediaries. The tone varied. Some were cautious, others sharp, but all carried the same underlying message. This law was not welcome here. For the officials, these encounters grew tense. They were enforcing a legal mandate, yet they could feel the atmosphere changing. Conversations shortened. Hospitality cooled. Eyes lingered longer than before. Even routine visits carried an edge. One figure who came to symbolize this shift was John Neville, a federal inspector whose role placed him squarely at the center of rising hostility. To the government, he was an administrator. Too many frontier residents, he became a symbol of intrusion, of imbalance, of being unheard. It is important to pause here and soften the story. What followed was not born of cruelty or chaos. It emerged from accumulation from months of pressure layered onto already difficult lives. When anger finally moved from idea to individual, it did so reluctantly. With hesitation and internal conflict, people argued among themselves about how far was too far. Some urged restraint, fearing consequences. Others believed that without visible resistance, nothing would change. These debates unfolded quietly, often late at night. When exhaustion lowered defenses and honesty surfaced eventually, confrontation became unavoidable. Not dramatic at first, a heated exchange, a refusal, a crowd gathering where once there had been only individuals. Each incident fed the next, reinforcing the sense that matters had moved beyond private complaint. The act of confronting a person made the conflict real in a new way. It brought fear alongside anger. Once names were attached, consequences felt closer. There was no longer the comfort of anonymity. For some, this realization sparked regret. For others, resolve. The frontier was accustomed to handling problems directly. Distance had taught when authority felt distant and inflexible, direct action seemed, to some, like the only remaining language. Yet even as tensions escalated, there was restraint. Violence was not the goal. Intimidation, protest, and symbolic acts were seen as means of expression rather than destruction. The line between resistance and rupture, however, grew thinner with each encounter. From the perspective of those enforcing the law, the situation felt increasingly precarious. They were few in number, traveling through unfamiliar terrain. Tasked with upholding authority that could not always protect them, Their vulnerability added another layer to the conflict, one that made every interaction heavier. This mutual unease created a feedback loop. Resistance became more visible. Enforcement became more cautious. Trust eroded further. What had once been a disagreement over policy was now a series of personal encounters charged with emotion. Looking back, this was the turning point, not because it marked the beginning of violence, but because it transformed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer about what the law said. It was about how it felt, how it entered lives, disrupted routines, and challenged identities. As night settles into this chapter of the story, the tone remains reflective rather than dramatic. Imagine a quiet road at dusk, a knock on a door, a conversation held just a little too tightly, the weight of words not spoken, and the knowledge that things are changing. When protest turned personal, the frontier crossed an invisible threshold. Resentment gained shape and direction, and though no one could yet see where it would lead, everyone could feel that the uneasy calm was giving way to something more fragile. In that moment, quiet, tense, and deeply human, the Whiskey Rebellion moved from whispered concern into direct confrontation, carrying with it the hopes, fears, and unresolved questions of a young nation still learning how to govern itself without losing its people. Some moments in history unfold not with thunder, but with a low, persistent tension that settles into the air and refuses to lift. The night at Bower Hill was such a moment. It did not begin as a battle, nor did it end with one. Yet what happened there echoed far beyond its stone walls, carrying consequences that reached the highest levels of the young American Republic. Bower Hill stood on elevated ground west of Pittsburgh. Solid and deliberate in its construction, it was more than a house. It was a symbol. Owned by John Neville, a federal inspector tasked with enforcing the whiskey excise tax. The estate represented authority made physical. Its position on the landscape mirrored Neville's position in the conflict, visible, immovable, and impossible to ignore. By the summer of 1794, tensions in the region had been rising for months. Murmurs had grown into warnings, and warnings into confrontations. Neville had already been targeted by threats and intimidation. His role made him a focal point, not because of who he was personally, but because of what he represented. Too many frontier residents, Bower Hill had come to embody the distant power shaping their lives without fully understanding them, as the sun set on the night that would later become infamous. The atmosphere around the estate was heavy with anticipation. Groups of men gathered quietly in the surrounding countryside, moving along familiar paths under the cover of darkness. They carried torches, not as symbols of destruction at first, but as necessity light against the dark, guidance through uneven terrain. The approach to Bower Hill was cautious. Voices were low. Instructions were passed along in murmurs. This was not a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of accumulated frustration. Still, uncertainty lingered. No one could predict how the night would unfold, or what lines might be crossed. Inside the estate, Neville and those with him were aware of the danger. The house had been fortified to some degree, and armed defenders stood watch. Windows glowed faintly from within, lantern light flickering against stone. The contrast between the illuminated interior and the surrounding darkness heightened the sense of separation inside and outside, authority and resistance. When the two sides finally encountered one another, the moment was charged but restrained. Words were exchanged. Demands were made. Refusals followed. The standoff that emerged was tense rather than explosive, defined by pauses as much as by action. Gunfire eventually broke the stillness, not in a sweeping exchange, but in sharp, unsettling bursts. Shots echoed across the hills, startling nearby residents and carrying far beyond the immediate scene. The sound alone marked a turning point. Whatever restraint had existed before was now strained. The confrontation escalated unevenly. Confusion spread. Orders were unclear. Fear mingled with resolve. In the chaos, one defender was killed and others wounded. The loss of life, though limited, cast a long shadow over the events that followed. As the night wore on, the balance shifted. The attackers withdrew temporarily, regrouping and reassessing. Bower Hill, though still standing, no longer felt secure. Its walls, once symbols of stability, now seemed vulnerable. The following day brought no relief. Instead, it brought resolve. A larger group returned, this time with clearer intent. The estate was surrounded once more. Neville was absent, having fled for safety. Those remaining inside faced an impossible choice. The decision to burn Bower Hill was not made lightly, but once made, it unfolded quickly. Flames took hold, climbing stone and timber alike. Smoke rose into the sky, visible from miles away. The fire transformed the estate from a symbol of authority into a symbol of defiance. The burning of Bower Hill was both dramatic and deeply unsettling. It marked the first time that resistance had manifested so visibly, so irrevocably. A line had been crossed not just locally, but nationally. Yet even in destruction, there was restraint. The fire was directed at the building, not indiscriminately at people. The act was symbolic, aimed at the presence of federal enforcement rather than personal vengeance. This distinction mattered deeply to those involved. Even if it would later be debated by others, news of the event traveled quickly, carried by writers and reports. As it spread, the story grew heavier. To some, it was proof of dangerous lawlessness. To others, it was evidence of desperation ignored for too long. For the federal government, the burning of Bower Hill was impossible to overlook. It was no longer a question of murmurs or isolated incidents. Authority had been challenged openly. The image of a federal officer's home in flames demanded response. For those on the frontier, the aftermath was quieter. Smoke cleared. The hills returned to stillness. People returned to their homes, carrying with them a mix of emotions: fear, relief, regret, and resolve. No one slept easily in the days that followed. The night at Bower Hill did not resolve the conflict. Instead, it clarified it. It transformed a diffuse resistance into a defined crisis. It forced the nation to confront the reality that disagreement had hardened into defiance. Looking back, it is tempting to see the burning as inevitable. But inevitability is often assigned after the fact. In the moment, it felt uncertain, fragile, and deeply human. People acted not as symbols, but as individuals shaped by pressure, belief, and fear. As this chapter settles into calm reflection, imagine the scene after the flames had died down. Charred stone cooling in the night air. The smell of smoke lingering. The hills silent once more, as if holding their breath. Bower Hill was gone, but its meaning endured. The fire illuminated more than wood and stone. It exposed the fragile balance between authority and consent, between law and lived reality. In that quiet aftermath, the Whiskey Rebellion entered a new phase. What had once been whispered now demanded answers. And the young republic, watching closely, prepared to respond, not just to an act of destruction, but to the deeper questions it revealed. As you rest now, let the image soften. The flames fade. The night grows still again. And history, having spoken loudly for a moment, settles back into silence, carrying its lessons forward in quiet echoes. In the days following the night at Bower Hill, the countryside did not erupt into chaos. There were no drums, no banners, no formal declarations. Instead, something quieter happened, something shaped by familiarity rather than force. Men left their homes at dawn, walking or riding. Pittsburgh's residents were divided, though not sharply. Many sympathized deeply with the farmers beyond the city. They understood the realities of frontier life, the scarcity of cash, and the importance of whiskey to rural economies. Some had family ties in the countryside, others had once lived there themselves before settling closer to trade routes. At the same time, Pittsburgh depended on stability. Its prosperity relied on order, on predictable commerce, on safe passage along rivers and roads. Open conflict threatened all of that. The city had invested in its connection to the federal government, seeing it as a guarantor of growth rather than an enemy. This dual loyalty created tension without shouting. People spoke carefully, aware that neighbors might feel differently. Support for the government did not necessarily mean hostility toward the farmers. Sympathy for the farmers did not automatically imply defiance of federal authority. City leaders found themselves in an especially delicate position. They were responsible for maintaining peace, yet they had limited means to do so. Openly opposing the Whiskey Boys could provoke confrontation. Appearing too welcoming might invite suspicion from federal authorities. Neutrality felt safest, but neutrality is rarely comfortable. Letters arrived from the east, urging calm and loyalty. Other messages came from nearby towns, asking for understanding and restraint. Pittsburgh became a listening post, absorbing concerns from both directions. Each new piece of information added complexity rather than clarity. Markets continued to operate, but cautiously. Supplies were stocked, just in case. Barges were loaded and unloaded with an eye toward the hills, where campfires could sometimes be seen in the distance at night. The sight was unsettling, not because it promised attack, but because it symbolized uncertainty. At home, families talked through possibilities. What if the city were forced to choose? What if conflict arrived at its gates? These questions lingered unanswered, hovering at the edge of sleep. Religious leaders urged peace from their pulpits. Merchants advocated restraint. Veterans of the Revolutionary War reminded others of how quickly situations could spiral beyond intention. Their words carried weight, grounding speculation in memory. Despite the rumors, no invasion came. Days passed, then weeks. The Whiskey Boys remained nearby but did not advance. This restraint puzzled some and reassured others. It suggested that the gathering was not driven by impulse, but by purpose, however unclear that purpose might be. The city's unease gradually transformed into watchful patience. People adjusted to the tension, folding it into daily routine. Life continued, though with an underlying alertness. Every decision felt provisional, as if awaiting confirmation from events yet to unfold. For many in Pittsburgh, this period was emotionally exhausting. To live between sympathy and loyalty required constant negotiation, internally and with others. There was no easy position to take. Each carried risk. Yet this discomfort also revealed something important about the young republic. It showed that disagreement did not automatically dissolve into chaos. That communities could exist in tension without tearing themselves apart. That uncertainty, while uncomfortable, could be endured. As night fell over the city, lights reflected softly on river water. The hills beyond grew dark. Somewhere out there, men gathered around fires, thinking of home. In the city, people did the same different lives, connected by shared unease. Pittsburgh waited, not passively, but attentively. It stood as a reminder that history often pauses before it moves, allowing people to feel the weight of possibility before choices are forced upon them. And in that pause, quiet, uncertain, and deeply human, the city revealed the fragile balance at the heart of the nation itself, still learning how to hold together. People whose lives touched history in very different ways. In the late summer of 1794, the weight of the nation seemed to rest quietly on the shoulders of one man. George Washington, revered as a hero of independence and trusted as a steady presence, now faced a challenge unlike any he had known before. This time, there was no foreign crown to resist, no distant empire to oppose. The conflict rising before him involved Americans, his own people. Washington was not a man given to haste. Throughout his life, he had learned the value of patience, of listening before acting. As president, he carried that habit into office, aware that every decision helped shape not just policy, but precedent. The Whiskey Rebellion placed him at a crossroads history had never tested. How does a republic enforce its laws without becoming what it once rejected? From his vantage point in the nation's capital, the reports arrived steadily. Letters described unrest in western Pennsylvania. Federal officials wrote of intimidation and resistance. Governors warned of instability. Newspapers speculated openly, sometimes exaggerating events, sometimes understating them. Washington read carefully, aware that truth often lay between extremes. What troubled him most was not the disagreement itself. Washington understood dissent. He had led a revolution born of it. What unsettled him was the possibility that the authority of the new federal government might dissolve before it had fully formed. If laws could be openly defied without consequence, what then held the nation together? Yet force carried its own dangers. Washington knew better than anyone the cost of military action. He had seen armies devastate landscapes and families. He understood how isolated violence could spiral beyond intention. Sending troops against citizens risked deepening divisions that might never fully heal. Privately, Washington wrestled with these thoughts. Publicly, he remained measured. He consulted advisors, weighed alternatives, and delayed decisions where possible. His goal was not punishment, but preservation of law, of unity, of trust. Some urged restraint, hoping the unrest would fade on its own. Others pressed for decisive action, warning that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. Washington listened to both sides, aware that neither offered certainty. The Constitution granted the federal government the right to enforce its laws, but the Constitution was still young, its authority untested in moments of internal strain. To act was to assert power. To refrain was to risk erosion of legitimacy. Either path carried consequence. Washington's internal struggle was quiet but profound. He did not seek confrontation. He sought clarity. What kind of nation was the United States becoming? One that governed through consent alone, or one that could, when necessary, compel obedience without cruelty? As days passed and tensions remained unresolved, Washington began to see the outlines of a decision forming. Not a rush to arms, but a demonstration of presence, of resolve, of lawfulness. If force was to be used, it would be measured, restrained, and unmistakably tied to legal authority. He understood that symbolism mattered. Any action taken would echo far beyond the immediate crisis. It would teach future generations how the Republic responded to internal challenge. This awareness weighed heavily on him. Washington's correspondence, during this period, reveals a man deeply concerned with unity. He spoke of the danger of faction, of the importance of showing that the government existed not in theory alone, but in practice. Yet he also emphasized mercy, cautioning against unnecessary severity. The decision to consider mobilizing militia forces was not made lightly. It represented a last resort, a signal that the government was prepared to act, but hoped not to. Washington believed that overwhelming presence might prevent actual bloodshed, persuading resistance to dissolve rather than escalate. Still, the thought of leading troops against Americans troubled him deeply. This was not the role he had envisioned when he accepted the presidency. He had hoped to guide the nation through example, not confrontation. As the moment approached, Washington reflected on his past. He remembered the fragile days of the Continental Army, when unity had been hard won and easily lost. He remembered the exhaustion of war, the longing for peace that followed victory. He did not want to undo that hard-earned calm. Yet leadership sometimes demands choices that feel deeply uncomfortable. Washington understood that refusing to decide was itself a decision, one that could allow disorder to spread unchecked. When he finally resolved to act, he did so with careful framing. The goal was enforcement of law, not retribution. The message was firmness, balanced with restraint. The authority of the government would be asserted, but its humanity preserved. In this, Washington revealed the essence of his leadership. He did not seek glory or domination. He sought balance. He aimed to demonstrate that a republic could be both strong and measured, that it could enforce rules without abandoning principles. As night falls on this chapter of the story, the image that remains is not one of marching troops, but of a man alone with responsibility, a leader weighing not just what could be done, but what should be done. Washington's struggle was not dramatic in appearance, but it was historic in meaning. For the first time, an American president faced the task of upholding national law against domestic resistance, setting a precedent that would shape the nation long after the immediate crisis passed. And as you rest now, letting the story soften and slow, this moment invites quiet reflection. It reminds us that leadership is often exercised not in moments of triumph, but in moments of tension, when the right path is unclear, and the cost of every choice must be carried with care in facing his own people. George Washington faced the true test of the Republic. In facing his own people, George Washington faced the true test of the Republic itself and sought, above all else, to hold it together. When the decision was finally made, it did not arrive with celebration or urgency. It arrived quietly, with orders written carefully and intentions weighed just as heavily as supplies. The federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion would not be sudden or chaotic. It would be slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. And so began the long march westward. For the first time in American history, the federal government prepared to enforce its laws through a unified show of national strength. Militia units were called from several states, forming a force larger than any the nation had previously assembled in peacetime. Yet, despite its size, the movement felt restrained, almost solemn. This was not an army marching toward conquest. It was a government walking carefully toward its own people. At the center of this moment stood George Washington, who understood the symbolic weight of every step. Though he would not remain with the troops for the entire journey, his early presence mattered deeply. It signaled that this action was lawful, constitutional, and taken with the utmost seriousness. The march began in stages. Units gathered, organized, and moved out slowly, traveling across uneven ground and through terrain that tested both patience and endurance. The roads were often little more than rutted paths, softened by autumn rains. Wagons creaked under the weight of supplies. Boots sank into mud. Progress was measured not in miles, but in effort. The landscape itself shaped the rhythm of the march. The Appalachian Mountains rose steadily before the troops, their slopes dense with forest, and their passes narrow and winding. These mountains had long defined the boundary between Eastern authority and Western independence. To cross them as a federal force carried meaning that went far beyond geography. Each day unfolded with routine precision. Camps were established, fires were lit, meals were prepared, guards were posted. There was discipline, but not spectacle. Soldiers spoke quietly among themselves, aware that this mission was unlike any they had trained for. Many were veterans of the Revolutionary War, now walking familiar ground under a very different purpose. As the columns moved westward, news traveled ahead of them. Communities along the route watched with mixed emotions. Some felt reassurance, believing the government was restoring order. Others felt unease, sensing that something fundamental was shifting. The sight of federal troops moving inland carried a message that could not be ignored. The government was present, and it was prepared to act. Yet the march was intentionally measured. Speed was not the goal. Presence was. Washington and his advisors believed that overwhelming force, displayed calmly, might prevent the need for violence altogether. The slow advance allowed time for reflection on both sides. For the soldiers, the journey offered long hours of thought. Marching through familiar countryside, they passed farms much like their own, fields being harvested, families preparing for winter. The realization settled in quietly. They were not moving toward an enemy defined by distance or difference. They were moving toward neighbors. That's awareness shaped behavior. Discipline was enforced not only to maintain order, but to prevent provocation. Looting, harassment, and excess were strictly forbidden. The army was meant to represent law, not domination. The symbolism of the march grew heavier with each passing mile. For the young republic, this was a test of legitimacy. Could a national government act decisively without losing moral authority? Could it demonstrate strength without cruelty? For those watching from the frontier, the slow approach carried its own message. It allowed time for fear to cool, for rumors to be reconsidered, for choices to be made. Some who had gathered in resistance began to disperse, deciding that confrontation was not worth the risk. Others simply waited. Uncertain, though March itself became the statement. It said that the government would not be ignored, but neither would it rush blindly into conflict. It would arrive deliberately, openly, and under the rule of law. As weeks passed, the weather turned cooler. Mornings brought mist. Evenings arrived early. Camps grew quieter as exhaustion set in, yet the movement continued, steady and unbroken. Washington eventually returned to the capital, leaving command in trusted hands. His departure did not weaken the message. By then, the symbol had been established. The nation had seen its president take responsibility for enforcing its laws, even when doing so carried personal and political risk. When federal troops finally reached the regions at the heart of unrest, they found less resistance than expected. The sight of such an organized, disciplined force had already done much of its work. The rebellion, which had flared through frustration and fear, began to dissolve under the weight of inevitability. Importantly, this outcome was shaped by the nature of the march itself. Its slowness allowed space for retreat without humiliation. Its scale discouraged escalation. Its restraint preserved the possibility of reconciliation. Looking back, the long march westward stands as one of the most quietly significant moments in early American history. It was not defined by battle, but by intention. Not by bloodshed, but by resolve. As this chapter settles into calm reflection, imagine those columns moving through fog-covered valleys. The sound of footsteps softened by earth. The creak of wagons. The steady rhythm of progress. They carried muskets and supplies. Yes, but they also carried something less tangible. The idea that a republic could enforce its laws without surrendering its soul. That authority could be asserted not through chaos, but through calm determination. In that slow, deliberate movement across mountains and muddy roads, the United States took another step toward defining itself not just as a nation born in revolution, but as one capable of holding together through restraint, patience, and purpose. And as you rest now, let the image fade gently, the march continuing into the distance, its meaning lingering long after the sound of footsteps disappears into the quiet of the hills. By the time federal troops reached the heart of the troubled region, the moment everyone had anticipated, debated, imagined had already begun to slip away. The confrontation that so many believed inevitable did not arrive with clashing arms or shouted commands. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost gently, carried on the weight of presence rather than action. The countryside had been watching the slow approach for weeks. Columns of militia moved deliberately through valleys and over ridges, their progress steady and unmistakable. The message they carried was clear without being spoken. The federal government was here, united and prepared, not eager for violence, but unwilling to retreat. For those who had gathered earlier in resistance, this realization changed everything. The Whiskey Boys had never seen themselves as an army. They had assembled as neighbors, driven by shared hardship and a sense of being unheard. Their strength lay in numbers and solidarity, not in strategy or hierarchy. As the federal force drew closer, the difference became impossible to ignore. Overwhelming force does not always compel through fear alone. Sometimes it persuades through inevitability. The sight of thousands of organized troops, disciplined, supplied, and legally sanctioned made clear that continued resistance would not end in negotiation, but in loss. Slowly, quietly, the gathering dissolved. Men returned home along the same paths they had taken weeks earlier. Camps emptied. Fires burned down to ash. Conversations that had once carried urgency now carried reflection. The decision to step back was not universally celebrated, but it was widely accepted. Survival, after all, often favors restraint. This outcome was shaped not by surrender in the dramatic sense, but by recognition. Recognition that the government was serious. Recognition that violence would bring consequences no one truly wanted. Recognition that the line between protest and tragedy was closer than many had realized. At the center of this resolution stood the careful approach chosen by George Washington and his advisors. The decision to mobilize overwhelming force while exercising restraint had been deliberate. The goal was not to crush opposition, but to demonstrate authority so clearly that resistance would no longer seem viable. It worked. There was no battlefield to memorialize, no victory to celebrate, no defeat to mourn. Instead, there was dispersal, a quiet unwinding of tension that had built for months. In its place came questions. What had this moment revealed about the young republic? Could law be enforced without bloodshed? Could authority be asserted without becoming oppressive? For the federal government, the outcome was reassuring. The Constitution had been tested and found capable of action. Laws were shown to carry weight beyond paper. The nation had demonstrated that it could respond decisively to internal challenge. Yet the absence of battle did not erase discomfort. Many on the frontier felt relief, but also lingering resentment. The underlying issues, distance from power, economic strain, cultural misunderstanding, had not vanished. They had merely been paused. Trials followed, but they were limited. Punishment was measured. Pardons were issued. These choices were intentional, designed to cool rather than inflame. The government sought closure without humiliation, stability without vengeance. For those who had resisted, the aftermath was complex. Some felt regret, others justification, many a mixture of both. Life returned to routine, but the memory remained of standing together, of watching authority arrive, of choosing not to cross a final line. The land itself seemed to absorb the tension. Fields were harvested, rivers flowed as they always had. Towns resumed their rhythms. The extraordinary faded back into the ordinary. And yet, something had changed. The confrontation without battle left behind a precedent. It showed that the federal government could assert itself internally. It also showed that restraint could be as powerful as force. This dual lesson would echo through American history, shaping responses to future unrest. For Pittsburgh and the surrounding regions, the episode became something spoken of quietly, then less often, then hardly at all. Without dramatic violence to anchor memory, the events softened with time. It became easier to move forward than to linger. But questions lingered beneath the surface. How close had the nation come to tearing itself apart? What might have happened if patience had failed on either side? How should a republic balance firmness with empathy? These questions had no immediate answers. They were not resolved by dispersal or pardons. Instead, they became part of the nation's ongoing conversation, one revisited whenever authority and dissent met again. As night settles into this chapter, the absence of battle feels almost louder than its presence would have been. Silence replaces gunfire. Reflection replaces reaction. The story slows, inviting contemplation rather than judgment. Imagine the moment after the troops arrived and found no enemy waiting. The stillness of fields, the quiet order of camps breaking down, the sense of something heavy lifting, even as uncertainty remained. A confrontation had occurred not between armies, but between ideas, between fear and resolve, between resistance and authority. It ended not with bloodshed, but with withdrawal. And in that ending, quiet, unresolved, and deeply human, the young republic learned that sometimes the most consequential moments in history are the ones when nothing happens at all. As you rest now, let that stillness settle. Let the questions drift without needing answers. The nation moved forward from that moment, carrying both confidence and caution, shaped by a confrontation that proved strength could exist without violence, and that peace, sometimes, arrives simply when everyone decides not to fight. When the movement of troops slowed and the countryside returned to its familiar rhythms, the question that lingered was not what had happened, but what would happen next. Authority had been asserted. Resistance had dissolved. Yet the work of holding the nation together was far from complete. In the quiet aftermath, the young republic faced a subtler challenge: how to respond without reopening wounds that had only just begun to close. Justice, after all, is never exercised in a vacuum. It speaks not only through verdicts and penalties, but through tone, timing, and intention. In the wake of the Whiskey Rebellion, every decision carried meaning far beyond the individuals involved. The nation watched closely, even if it did so in silence. Federal courts began their work carefully. A limited number of individuals were arrested and charged, chosen not to make examples through excess, but to affirm that the law existed and could be enforced. The process was deliberate, almost restrained by design. Trials proceeded according to established rules, signaling that ordinate retribution was the guiding principle. For many on the frontier, this period was filled with quiet anxiety. Families waited. Communities watched. People wondered whether the government would now tighten its grip, whether punishment would spread outward, touching anyone who had spoken too loudly or gathered too openly. Memories of distant empires lingered, coloring expectations with fear. But the response that followed was measured. Convictions were few. Sentences were limited. And then came the most telling gesture of all: pardons. When George Washington chose to extend clemency to those convicted, the decision carried profound weight. It was not an admission that the law had been wrong, nor was it a dismissal of the disruption that had occurred. It was a statement, quiet but unmistakable, that enforcement did not require cruelty, and that unity mattered more than triumph. Pardons are often misunderstood. They are not the absence of justice, but a particular expression of it. In this case, they served to draw a line under the conflict rather than drag it forward. They allowed the nation to breathe again. Washington understood something essential about leadership in a republic: that authority must be firm enough to stand, yet gentle enough to be accepted. Too much severity would harden resentment. Too much leniency would invite defiance. Balance was the goal, and balance requires restraint. The message sent by these choices traveled slowly but clearly. The government would act when challenged, but it would also listen when calm returned. It would uphold the law without seeking to humiliate those who had opposed it. This was not weakness, it was confidence. For those who had resisted, the pardons offered relief, but also reflection. Life resumed. Fields were tended. Distilleries returned to quiet operation. Yet the memory of standing at the edge of conflict remained. The government had seen them. The government had responded, and then, crucially, it had stepped back. This outcome allowed communities to heal without denying what had occurred. There was no forced forgetting, but there was permission to move on. Conversations shifted from anger to adaptation. People adjusted, not because they had been crushed, but because the path forward had been left open. The federal government, too, learned from the experience. Authority had been tested and proven viable. Yet the cost of enforcement, logistical, emotional, political, was now understood more clearly. Future decisions would carry this memory, shaping how power was exercised. In the broader sweep of American history, this moment often fades into the background. It lacks the drama that captures imagination. There are no famous speeches attached to it, no decisive battles to commemorate, but its importance lies precisely in what it avoided. By choosing restraint, the nation avoided creating martyrs. By choosing mercy, it avoided deepening divides. By choosing law tempered with forgiveness, it modeled a form of governance still rare in the world at the time. This delicate balance did not solve every problem. Resentments did not vanish overnight. Economic strain remained. Debates over federal power continued, but the Republic had passed through a moment of internal crisis without fracturing and that mattered deeply. As nights grew quieter and the memory of confrontation softened, people returned to ordinary concerns. Children grew, seasons turned. The extraordinary slipped back into the fabric of daily life, where history often does its most enduring work. From a distance, it can be tempting to judge events by their outcomes alone. But in this case, the manner of resolution is what deserves attention. It revealed a nation capable of learning, adjusting, and choosing restraint over excess. As you rest now, let this chapter settle gently. Imagine the silence after tension has passed, the kind that follows a storm that never quite breaks. The air feels clearer, the ground steadier. The future, still uncertain, feels possible again. Mercy and justice are often portrayed as opposites. In this moment, they worked together. Authority stood firm, but forgiveness softened its edges. And in that careful balance, the United States took another quiet step toward becoming not just a nation of laws, but but a nation capable of wisdom. Let the story slow here. Let the questions fade. What remains is a sense of steadiness of a young republic, choosing not the loudest response, but the one that allowed its people to rest, rebuild, and continue forward together. When the noise of conflict fades, what remains is rarely dramatic. There are no banners lowered, no final speeches delivered to mark the end. Instead, meaning settles quietly, almost invisibly, into the spaces left behind. This is where the Whiskey Rebellion now resides, not in headlines or monuments, but in the soft background of American history, where its lessons continue to whisper rather than declare. For many Americans, the rebellion is barely remembered at all. It occupies a paragraph in textbooks, if that. Compared to the revolution that came before it, or the Civil War that followed, it feels small, almost incidental. And yet, its quiet resolution may be exactly why it matters. The Whiskey Rebellion did not end with a decisive victory or a crushing defeat. It ended with dispersal, restraint, and mercy. In a culture that often remembers history through spectacle, this makes it easy to overlook. But nations are not held together by spectacle alone. They are held together by choices made when emotions are high and consequences unclear. At its heart, this rebellion was never just about whiskey or taxes. It was about distance between lawmakers and farmers, between theory and daily life, between national ambition and local survival. These distances exist in every large society. They cannot be eliminated entirely. They can only be managed. The young United States learned something essential in this moment. Power, if it is to endure, must be exercised with awareness of how it is felt. Laws written with good intentions can still cause harm if they fail to account for lived reality. Authority may be necessary, but legitimacy depends on more than enforcement alone. Equally important was the lesson learned by those who resisted. The rebellion demonstrated that collective action carries weight, but also risk. Standing together can draw attention, but it can also provoke responses that cannot be undone. The decision to step back before violence fully erupted was as consequential as the decision to gather in the first place. This mutual restraint is what gives the episode its lasting resonance. Both sides reached a limit and chose not to cross it. The government enforced the law, but tempered its response. The rebels challenged authority, but ultimately withdrew. Neither achieved everything they wanted. Both avoided something far worse. Compromise is often misunderstood as weakness. In reality, it is one of the most demanding acts a nation can perform. It requires accepting imperfection, living with unresolved tension, and choosing continuity over certainty. The Whiskey Rebellion was resolved not because every issue was settled, but because enough people chose to live with less than total victory. Over time, this choice allowed the nation to move forward. The rebellion did not define American identity, but it quietly shaped it. It helped establish the principle that federal law would be upheld. It also demonstrated that enforcement need not be absolute or unforgiving. This balance between firmness and flexibility would be tested again and again in the centuries to come. The quiet aftermath also reveals something about collective memory. Americans tend to remember moments that affirm clear narratives. Freedom won, evil defeated, unity achieved. The Whiskey Rebellion offers a more complicated story, one where good intentions collided, and resolution came not through triumph, but through restraint. Perhaps that is why it faded. Remembering it requires acknowledging that disagreement is not an anomaly, but a constant. That unity is not a permanent state, but an ongoing effort. That holding a nation together is less about grand moments and more about patient, sometimes uncomfortable choices. In the end, the rebellion left no battlefield to visit, no clear heroes or villains. What it left instead was a precedented demonstration of how a republic might survive its own internal strain without destroying itself. This lesson remains quietly relevant. Power still creates distance. Policies still affect people unevenly. Voices still rise from places far from decision-making centers. The question is not whether tension will exist, but how it will be handled. The Whiskey Rebellion suggests that survival lies not in denying conflict, nor in crushing it, but in engaging it with restraint, in recognizing when to act decisively and when to step back, in understanding that authority gains strength not only from force, but from the willingness to forgive. As this story draws to a close, it does so without Dromogis, as the rebellion itself did. The hills return to stillness. The roads quiet. Life resumes its familiar pace. History exhales and moves on. And yet, the meaning lingers. It lingers in the idea that a nation is not held together by laws alone, but by the care with which those laws are applied. It lingers in the understanding that compromise is not the absence of principle, but the practice of it. It lingers in the reminder that silence, when chosen wisely, can be as powerful as any declaration that as you rest now. Let these thoughts settle gently, without urgency. The past does not demand judgment here, only attention. In the quiet left behind by this forgotten rebellion, there is room to reflect, to release, and to sleep. The nation moved forward then, not because it was flawless, but because it chose to hold itself together. And in that choice, soft-spoken, imperfect, and human, its truest strength was revealed.